Good evening. We are going to start tonight in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. We've got about 10 weeks before we hit the summer series. And so want to be able to do a book that we can cover in that amount of time, and I think we can do that with Ecclesiastes. It's a interesting book. It's been something that's been a good while since I've taught through for myself. I know I hadn't done it here at Barrettville, but anyway, it's a really good book to look at. In a lot of ways, it is gets a reputation for being very depressing, but I think in a lot of ways, the way that there's a lot of things in it that I think can be really good, significant things to help find meaning in life. And so from that standpoint, it's not as depressing, I think, a lot of times as it gets billed. But anyway, we're going to look at that starting tonight. I want you to, if you write down anything or whatever, I would recommend that you read for next week 1 Kings 10, and then also 1 Kings 11, the first 8 verses. So you can read the 1 Kings 10, and then the first 8 verses of chapter 11. The reason for this is that's when the Queen of Sheba came to Solomon, and Solomon showed her all that he had as far as his material things. And I think for perspective's sake, it's really important to look at it in a study of Ecclesiastes to see what kind of wealth we're dealing with. Because there it essentially itemizes the things that he has. And so it's really an impressive amount. You'll notice when you look at that it's only been in the last very few years that anyone has eclipsed him in wealth. And then of course if you go back that far and reverse inflation, for considering those in his time, he's the wealthiest man that's ever lived, undoubtedly. But even without that curve, it's only a small handful of people on the planet today that if he had what he had then, there's a very small amount of people that would be wealthier than him even today. It's a very, very small list. When the gold in your storehouse gets weighed basically in tons, you got a lot. And so anyway, it's really amazing. So anyway, you look at that, and it goes a long way toward helping us understand. I would look at that tonight, but I hadn't told you that in advance because I want you to read that and look at it before we talk about that some next week. The book of Ecclesiastes it's a 12-chapter book, short chapters at that. And when you look at this book, we're going to see it tonight. We're going to try to do basically a chapter a week. We may not exactly get that done. We may do 2 chapters one week at some point. But that's generally the idea of what I want to cover. But when you look at this book, what you find out is a little later in the chapter we see that he calls himself the preacher. He says that in first verse. He says that in different places throughout the book. But he says in verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now that narrows down, obviously, who it is we're talking about, that being the son of David. Now, we'll say, well, it's Solomon. Well, maybe, because there's a lot of people that call themselves son of David, okay? All the kings of Judah would refer to themselves as the son of David. But I do believe it is Solomon, okay? So just by that designation, son of David doesn't necessarily mean that. I mean, Jesus called himself son of David. And so recognizing that son of David surely shows you the lineage, shows that he's a king, and that narrows it down pretty much. But the fact that he calls himself the preacher, and when you look at the wealth that he had in 1 Kings 10, and then you look at the wealth displayed in the book of Ecclesiastes, and then you recognize that Solomon is the author of the book of Proverbs and Song of Solomon and a couple of the a couple of the Psalms. It all fits. And really, if you ask yourself, if not Solomon, then who? And there really is nobody else that would match. Because first of all, the wisdom in the book and the position of the individual in the book, and then also the wealth of the individual in the book. You know, the after Solomon, the prestige and the wealth and the power of the kingdom of Israel went down significantly. And so for many reasons, I'm going to understand, like about all scholars do, that this is Solomon writing this. And so,
isn't there hints in it, though, that the kingdom was still united at this time? Because he mentions Israel and Jerusalem.
Yes, the kingdom was united. There are three kings, of course, in the United Kingdom: Saul, David, and Solomon. And they each reigned about 40 years. So, 120 years for the United Kingdom. And then, if you remember, the divided kingdom happened when Solomon's son assumed the throne after Solomon died, Rehoboam. And Rehoboam had the people come to him and say, "We want a break. Your father taxed us heavily." And Rehoboam had the older, wiser advisors say, "Yes, the people deserve a break." And then the younger ones, his contemporaries, said, "No, you need to do even more and better and bigger things than your father did." So that's when he says, "My father chastised you with whips, I'll chastise you with scorpions." And he said, my finger is going to be thicker than my father's waist. And so you're not getting a break. It's going to be worse. Well, it was at that point that 10 of the tribes said, "See ya." And everybody except for Benjamin and Judah and the Levites. The Levites all left their places and moved down to Judah. But basically, Judah and Benjamin and Ephraim, the half-tribe of Ephraim, I believe, stayed too. But the two main tribes, Judah and Benjamin, because Benjamin was inside of Judah, surrounded by it. But those two tribes and the Levites, they become the southern kingdom of Judah. And everybody else, Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Gad, Asher, all them, they became the northern kingdom, which the designation from then on, Judah was the southern kingdom and Israel was the northern kingdom. And so from then on, Israel was that group and Judah the other one.
But
and
he uses terms throughout the book of Israel.
He does, because they were united, and during the united kingdom, Israel was God's people. When the divided kingdom happens, and Jeroboam becomes king in Judah, and then the northern kingdom becomes Jeroboam, southern kingdom Rehoboam. When Jeroboam takes over, they're from then on, all the rest of that time, Israel is the northern kingdom, Judah is the southern. And when they're talking about those, they're talking about two different entities at that point.
But he's talking about Jerusalem, which is in...
Correct. Jerusalem, in Ecclesiastes, because it's still United Kingdom,
Right.
Israel and Judah are going to be synonymous. And of course, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and Judah at that time. Later on, it's going to be, separate. But for this book's perspective, Jerusalem is where Solomon was going to be, and where all the kings descended from David were. So, the words of the preacher, the son of David, the king of Jerusalem. what you will see in this book is Solomon's reflections. When you see this book and when it unfolds, it is the reflections of an older man who is probably, maybe not on his deathbed, but he's at a point where he knows the road's not going to go much longer. And he is thinking back upon his life. Now, another part of what I want you to read, those couple things in 1 Kings 10, and that first part in chapter 11 in 1 Kings, is that in that part in 1 Kings 11 is where it tells you that he had 700 wives. But it also tells you that those wives drew Solomon away. You see, the great problem was not the 700 wives, okay? That's a terrible idea. If you know, every time somebody had more than one wife in the Bible, it's a mess, okay? It just always is. But the 700, the worst part about it was not that he had 700 wives, is that they were foreign wives. And he allowed them to bring their idolatrous worship. And so Solomon is the gateway for idolatry back into Israel. That is the, you know, we talk about Solomon being a wise man, and he was, but he's kind of I call it a bucket of contradictions. You know, you open up the bucket, what's in there? Well, there's some contradictions. Yes, he's wise, but he does do some foolish things. And the very big foolish thing he does is he brings in these 700 wives, but most of them were done as contract arrangements between peace treaties. You know, you seal a treaty. You know, if you want to be at peace with somebody and you don't want this strong nation, which Israel was at the time, because David conquered everybody. David was a great conqueror and wiped out all the enemies. And so everybody wanted to make a peace treaty with Solomon. And so how they sealed the peace treaty is they would give a daughter, a princess usually, to Solomon for another wife. You're not likely to invade a nation where your father-in-law is the king. That's kind of a way of doing that. Now, we don't need to have a talk about how that's unfair to women, because it is, okay? But you know, that's the way it was in the ancient world. And so instead of a handshake, he gave a princess to Solomon in a way to seal the deal. And so that's the way that worked. Well, all of that is what it is, but the bad thing was that Solomon allowed all of these idolatrous women to bring their idol worship. So now all of a sudden, it was a complete menagerie of the who's who of the idolatrous throughout the world. And so, even though he basically stayed toward the Lord, but he violated some of the really big things of allowing the idolatry to even be on his soil. And so in that, it is a big, big sin that Solomon commits that ends up being ultimately, many years down the road, the undoing of both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. It's that idolatry that got brought in. And so, yes, he is very wise. Yes, he says great things. Yes, he wrote Ecclesiastes. Yes, he wrote Proverbs. Yes, he wrote Song of Solomon. But it wasn't all perfect. And so what you've got here in the book of Ecclesiastes is you have the perspective of someone that's been there and done that on all those things, and someone who has the foresight and the hindsight of looking on their life. Now, you probably know this book at least enough to know how it ends. How does it end? What's the most famous verse in the whole book is in the last chapter. Yeah, fear God and keep His commandments. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments. For that's the whole of man, or the whole duty of man. That's what he ends up with. What you have in all 12 chapters is how he comes to that conclusion. Oh, he could have saved himself a lot of heartache had he done this. This is very much the equivalent of a young person sitting down on a stool next to an older man who's got his pocket knife out there, and he's peeling an apple, and the young man comes and sits down next to him and says, you need to listen to what this man says, because this man is going to tell you all about life, the things you need to learn in life. And if you want to save a lot of trouble in your life, you listen to what he has to say. And if we approach the book of Ecclesiastes like that, I think we're going to find some things in it as well. That if we approach this is a man who has been there and done that and experienced a lot of things, and if we learn from his mistakes and from some of his successes, if we learn from what he did, then we're going to be way ahead of the curve when it comes to what we need to learn in life. You see, everything's in the Bible. One of the things he says often is there's nothing new under the sun. And that's true. Everything's there in the Bible for us to learn and us to see, if we just learn what's there, if we just let it sink within us and we internalize it and take that in. Okay, enough about introduction for tonight. Let's go to verse 2. A phrase you see all throughout this book. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. You could put in there the word worthless, or another phrase that ends up coming through here a lot is striving after the wind and similar kinds of things. It's all meaningless, purposeless. What does man gain? Verse 3, by all his toil, at which he toils under the sun. What does he get from all his hard work? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises, the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. Now, you notice the subtlety of the wisdom in this? The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. Now, how does that work? It only works if it's a round globe. You know? I mean, this isn't a science manual, okay? So I don't want to stretch it to be something it's not. But for the sun to come up, what's my orientation? That's east, I think. They're about east and set in the west. For it to come here, go there, and end up there, it's got to go all the way around to do that. And so to think about that it rises, goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. Verse 6, the wind blows to the south and goes around to the north, and around goes the wind. On its circuits, the wind returns.
The earth doesn't have any say about what it's going to do.
Right, the earth doesn't have any say about what it's going to do.
And he sets man to give him the choice to do what.
Right, and man gets the choice as to what they do. That's very true. But you notice the wind being in the circuit, that's a really remarkable thing. Because what he is describing is, in a very rudimentary way, the jet stream and the cyclical nature of the winds. And that's something that is a more modern realization about the weather patterns in our world. That the wind does have a all-encompassing effect, that it goes and it'll come back the same way and does that. So that's a pretty intriguing thing. Verse 7, all streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. That's kind of curious, isn't it? That thing never fills up. Why is that? Well, he doesn't give an explanation to it in this, but we know that some of it goes in there and then it evaporates and ends up in the clouds, and then the clouds, it rains and lands on the hillside, and anyway, the water table goes about. But he brings those things up. The last part of verse 7, to the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be. What has been done is what will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. For there is the thing of which is said, see, this is new, but it has been already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things, yet to be among those who come after. Now, I will say that we live in a time that things have rapidly changed. Rapidly and amazingly changed. But in reality, so many of the things that have changed have actually been things that have been here, and they've been things that have been, we have a new way of looking at them or whatever. But life is still the same. The human body is still the same. We as a people are still ultimately the same. And the things that are there are still a product of this world and a product of who we are. And the more things really change, in a lot of ways they do stay a lot the same. The things that divide us, that cause us trouble today, are the same things we've been fighting since the beginning of time. You know, we don't get along well with each other a lot of times. Why? We don't like each other because of whatever. And that's very unfortunate. That's not what God wants us to do. It's not how God wants us to live, because He wants us to be good to all. He wants us to be kind to all. And so we have that admonition to do that.
The minute you take God out of anything is when the chaos starts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The moment you take God out of anything, chaos starts. That's exactly right. And, you know, and you see that in the Bible. I mean, you read the book of Judges, and the phrase that keeps coming up in the book of Judges is, there was no king in Israel, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. Well, it's the most deplorable, despicable time of the Israelite nation, because they did all kinds of wicked stuff because they didn't have a king. Anybody that believes they're a libertarian ought to read the book of Judges. I mean, quite honestly, you know, we need some kind of central government. Maybe not as big government as some people would want, but, you know, everybody doing their own thing is not always a good thing. In fact, it's most likely not a good thing, because, you know, everybody doing what's right in their own eyes gets us in a mess in a big hurry. So, anyway. And back to Jamie's point, anytime that God's not a part of what we're doing, the chaos comes on fast when God's not a part of it. Any other comments or questions? Hearing this? But you notice that he is describing how that everything just kind of keeps going on. That when something good happens or something bad happens, what does the sun do? Same thing it did yesterday. Now, you know, there may be clouds. You know, if you can believe the weather forecast, we might get to see the sun a little bit tomorrow morning. But toward the afternoon, it's going to get rainy and the wind's going to commence. And, you know, hold on to your hat tomorrow evening from what it sounds. But what happens? Well, it's going to be temporary, isn't it? Just because there's high winds tomorrow evening doesn't mean we're going to have high winds for the next 3 months. It'll probably last a day or so, because it takes its cycle. But every day, The sun will go down. It's probably going down right about now. And it'll be dark here in a little while after we dismiss. And if God doesn't come back, long about 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, it's going to peak out and be back again. It's just because that's what it does. And it doesn't matter what happens tonight. No matter what kind of chaos happens tonight, the sun's going to come up unless the Lord returns. Because that's what it does. God put it all in place. And God's plan and God's purpose is in such place that there is that consistency. And it's really important because, you might remember back from your junior high science days that the planets and the sun and everything, none of it's stationary in the universe. It always has blown my mind that maybe one of you knows better than I do, but the Earth is moving through the universe at what like 250,000 miles an hour it is. We're going around the sun, I think it is. It's some crazy number like that we're hurtling through space at like 200-some thousand miles per hour through space around the sun. It's a long trip we make around the sun. And we're doing that, and then the moon's moving around us, and all these other things are going on, and they don't collide. Everything stays, God's designed it so that we all stay in order. The earth turns the right amount of time every single day. The sun comes up. We realize that it's not actually the sun that does literally come up, but we spin around to make it look like it comes up. But yet we're going around and all that stuff. All of that is what it shows is there's an intelligent designer behind all of that, because it's not really chaos. God has it all designed the right way so that it all works, but realizing it is all in place. And everything we do does not change what it does. The earth still spins, the sun is there in the sky the next day as the sun makes its revolution. And then we go around it to give us the seasons for the year. And the wind blows the way that it does. And all these things happen so that we go through all that we do. And the world goes on. Yes, Tom?
That's why I don't worry about climate change and global warming.
Yeah. Well, I said recently, I think I might have said in the class here a few weeks ago, the moment we go carbon neutral is the day God's going to tell Jesus to come back. We're going to spend all that money and all that time and all that effort to go carbon neutral, and then God's going to burn it. It's all going to be carbon. It's all going to get burnt. So we can spend all we want to try to save the planet, but when God says it's time to fry it all and have Judgment Day, it'll be. So anyway, yeah, it seems like from an evolutionary perspective, you see, that's where all this is coming from. Evolutionists think the world's been here for it's 20 billion, I think it is now. The Earth's been here for 20 billion years, and we've got to preserve it for the next 20 billion. Well, no, we don't. God created it in 7 days, like it says in Genesis, and when God's ready for it to be destroyed, it'll be destroyed. So.
Clinton also said it'll be winter, summer, hot, cold.
Right,
Now,
right.
It varies, but it never changes.
Right. And you know what? If I see somebody littering, I'm going to tell them to stop that. I don't like that. I want to drink clean water and breathe clean air. but we also have to be sensible about it. This earth was here for our use, and it's not our job. It's not our now this will preach right here. It's not our job to save the planet. It's our job to save the world. That's what our job is. We need to save the world, the lost people in the world. That's what we're here for. God will handle the planet, but we need to be about saving the world. That's a good bumper sticker right there. It's not our job to save the planet, but to save the world. I like that. You can steal that and make $1 million of it. Just buy me a nice steak dinner if you do, or something.
I got a magic marker, I'll just write on the back of your truck.
Yeah. Well, better hope Amy doesn't find out about that. You doing that? You have to deal with her. All right. Anything else? Through the verse 11 verses. All right. Verse 12. I, the preacher, had been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. Now that's a tall order, isn't it? I sought to learn everything under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. You think about that. It is, as he says, an unhappy business that God has given us to be busy with. And this is one of those moments where, and they're rare, you might look and say, this man's a Bible author, but he's off base. Now he understands that it is a tough thing, but the problem is he is misunderstanding what God wants him to do. You see, if he interjected what he will say in the last part of the book, to fear God and keep your commandments, then he'll view this verse in a different light. He says it's an unhappy business what God has given for his children to do. Well, that differs from what conclusion he comes to, because see, he's looking at the problems. He's looking at the things here. He's not looking at it through a spiritual lens at this point. And so he's getting caught up in the mess and the vanity of life. And by doing that, he's missing the real point, which he will come to learn, come to understand later on. Yes, life can be a messy business, but it doesn't have to be an unhappy business for those that are children of God, unless we get caught up in the wrong things. But once we do get caught up in the wrong things, then all it does is it rules us. You see, that's what happens. Our lives run us. We need to run our lives. But we get ourselves so busy and so wrapped up in things that our lives will run us. And that's what happens when your life runs you. And because he is seeing this and seeing that, views this all as an unhappy business that he has in life, well, if he focused on what he really should have been doing, then it would have been a much better place for him in that regard. Verse 14, I've seen everything that is under the sun. Behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. Can you catch the wind? And when you do, what are you going to do with it? Shows you the silliness, the striving after wind, and how that is so, how that doesn't work. And what is crooked cannot be made straight. Have you ever gone and bought a pile of lumber, and you get home, and a couple of those boards look about like that? They look about that straight. And you know what? You can't do a thing with that. If it's got just a little bit, maybe, but if it's crooked, if it's like, as they say, like a dog's hind leg, you can't do anything with that. It's impossible to change that, really, with any kind of realistic thing. Now, you could maybe work with it and soak it and heat it up and do some different things, but it's not very easy, and it's a lot of effort. It's so much easier to go back to the store and get another board, because when it's crooked, you can't do anything with it. And life is that way. When it's made crooked, when you do it wrong, you can't straighten it out. And so that's what he gives for them to hear. Yes, Kathy?
I think maybe Solomon was speaking more in terms of people that you can't make straight, you can't, when you think of an average person with average good judgments and average common sense, and you look around you and you see all of this craziness that you can't do anything about, you can't convince people to be different.
Right.
And imagine what he felt, the wisest person who's ever lived. People must have seemed really insane to him. So he's suffering not only through this lack of what I can't fix, but how much is unfixable in a human condition.
Right. Yeah, and Kathy brings up a very good point. I think you're exactly right, that he's talking about what's crooked can't be fixed or can't be straightened, and talking about in some ways the condition of life, but also very much people. That if a person is that way, if they're just warped, and that you can't do anything with that. And that's very true. And that's the way it is today. I mean, there's a lot of people that are just plain warped. I mean, you just cannot reason with them, that you're not going to get them to see things the way that you see them. You can say to them what God says. You can point it out in Scripture, and they don't care. They don't care. In fact, all they do is get angrier. And so it does not do anything. They are warped, and they're not going to be changed. What I've heard before, and I like to use, is that they've got a mind like concrete. It's thoroughly mixed up and it's permanently set. There's nothing you can do about it. As hard as can be, and it's mixed up and it's permanently set. Well, that's very much the way it is. When it's crooked, you can't do much with it. So if you poured the concrete wrong, there's not a lot you can do to change that. Verse 16, I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all that were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And again, this is one of those verses that you look at that and say, it's got to be Solomon that's writing this. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived it is also about striving after wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Now I want you to notice, again, that he's a bucket of contradictions. There's contradictions there, okay? I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. Now, if you're trying to understand firsthand madness and folly, you know what that is? That's madness and folly. That is not, like the preacher that said, I want to try it so I know how to preach against it. No. That's not a good idea. Terrible idea. I didn't say that. Andy didn't say that. But that's a terrible idea. You don't have to wallow in madness and folly in order to know it's madness and folly. But Solomon says, I want to know wisdom, but to cover everything and be fair and balanced, I'm going to talk about madness and folly too. Well, that's a bad idea. What's that? Yeah, he does a little bit, doesn't he? Sound like a college student. Yeah. And so, in trying to understand everything, he missed a lot of the most important things. If he viewed the business of doing what God had for him as an unhappy business, and he viewed everything he had as chasing after the wind, and he's trying to focus on knowledge or focus on wisdom, madness, and folly, that is going to make you crazy. And all of that, in an attempt to know, ends up being a great increase of sorrow. You don't have to know everything. And Solomon tried it, and all he got was sick. All he got was madness. All he got was vanity and vexation and chasing after the wind. Now, it's important to know some things, and know some things well, but if you can't know everything, and that caused him a lot of heartache. Any last questions, comments, anything? Yes, Kathy?
The book of Proverbs is three things. First, you have knowledge, then you have understanding, then you have wisdom. And actually, Ecclesiastes is somewhat the same.
It is, yeah.
Because in the end product of all of this is his wisdom.
Right, yeah. The result, wisdom comes from taking the knowledge that we get and applying that. Also, you remember when we look through the book of Proverbs, the first several chapters of Proverbs is written from the perspective of a father writing to a son. And that really is a lot the way that Ecclesiastes is written. It doesn't come out and say that, but it very much is written from that perspective as someone, giving their advice later in life to someone that's younger to don't do what I did, learn from my mistakes. All right, thanks. We'll look at 1 Kings 10 and 11 and then Ecclesiastes 2 next week.